Hello, and welcome to Ending Physician Overwhelm. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Mello. I'm a family and obesity medicine physician, as well as a certified life coach for physicians. In this podcast, we talk about how the learned habits of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and a lack of boundaries show up in our lives and how they contribute to burnout, exhaustion, and overwhelm. The healthcare system is broken, my friends, but let's not wait for it to be fixed in order to feel better. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Ending Physician Overwhelm. I am grateful as always for you to be here listening, and I hope that you'll find today's episode to be helpful in understanding things that might be going on in yourself or in people that you know and love. Because today we're going to be talking about trauma and the ways that this can show up for us, or again, in other people and people that we care about, and trying to normalize how it shows up for us and to normalize that help is available. And we really should engage with the help that we need when we are experiencing signs of trauma. So let's dive in. I love the definition of thinking of trauma as too much, too fast. And I would add with too little support. Any experience that we have where we are having too much responsibility, too much chaos, too much disaster coming at us in a rapid pace or in a recurrent pace, and we don't have the adequate resources or help that we need in order to move through it the way that our nervous system requires. This is a much more expanded concept of trauma than most of us have been exposed to. We have been tending to think about big T trauma. And of course, we've talked about this before. Soldiers who go to war, right? That's the classic example. And that was sort of the gold standard against which all other traumas were compared. But let's think about all the other, big T and little t kind of traumas. Certainly assaults, car accidents, or other sort of disaster events. We've had all these terrible weather events going on, right? Somebody could experience big T trauma having, been in the middle of a hurricane, unfortunately. There are many of those kinds of experiences, but also there are many little t traumas, right? Where there isn't one big catastrophic event that happened, but recurrent events where we felt like we did not have what we needed in order to be able to cope with whatever was going on. And in physicians, in healthcare, little t trauma is remarkably common when we frequently feel that we are on the line, that we are responsible, that we don't have any access to boundaries, that we don't have enough tools or help or support to be able to manage the very real needs of our patients, some of which are life-threatening, but many of which are emotionally fraught, right? If you are someone who does surgery and often does emergency surgery, and you frequently don't have enough help, so you are on call frequently, nothing big T has necessarily happened there, but you are frequently on the line without enough support, sleep, backup for very real, very harmful circumstances, right? If you don't remove that appendix urgently, then, right, they could get septic and very, very ill. And if that happens over and over and over again, where all of these appendixes or gallbladders or whatever those emergency surgeries are coming in over and over and over again, and you are constantly on the line, that can land in your body as trauma. Similarly, I've had the experience this week of multiple patients coming in with poorly understood, widespread pain of unclear origins, some of which I've known for a very long time, and some of which are new. And, it's the patient who shows up to me saying, I've had pain my whole life in my whole body, and I'm here to figure out what it is. It just so happened that multiple of these patients showed up in my office, kind of within rapid succession, and upset, demanding answers, right? Demanding treatments. And I had just this little glimmer of, I don't know, a throwback to how I felt in my prior practice, where this would be a constant occurrence, right? Where people came in with unexplained or difficult circumstances. They didn't have adequate resources. I didn't have adequate resources. Just this feeling that I was constantly on the hook for this human suffering and without the way to be able to access help. And I'm not in that circumstance now. This was just kind of a glimmer reminder. And I felt some of the way that I had felt before, where I felt very trapped or stuck. And I know that at that time, when I was in my prior practice, I was really experiencing quite a bit of trauma responses. I was crying every day. I was feeling like nobody understood, what was going on. I was having responses that were very strange, where if somebody approached me from the left side and I had them in my peripheral vision, I would sometimes get this inexplicable panic response. I don't know why. I still don't know why that happened or why it was triggered by somebody coming to me on the left side, but it was something that I ultimately needed to get some treatment for. And I share that as an example because I think, especially as women physicians, many of us experience this trauma response kind of reaction that doesn't make sense to us. And we often brush it aside, push it away, and suffer in silence. And I'd like for us to stop doing that, but it takes a little bit of understanding of what's going on, what are the options, how can I start to make this better for myself? And so that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. So let's start out with acknowledging that if you've experienced any of this, your emotional reaction is going to often feel irrational. But what's really going on is that you have somewhere a deep-seated sense of lack of safety. Now, your rational brain probably knows that there's nothing truly unsafe going on, right? You are not in threat of actual physical danger to your body if you are constantly responsible for the needs of other people, right? So if you are on call more often than your body can handle and you're having to do a lot of work, you are, I suppose, in some kinds of physical threat, but it isn't the same as, hanging off the edge of a building or being in a war-torn setting, right? It is not the same, but you are having the same kind of response because of the way that your nervous system, your primitive brain and your nervous system are interpreting the signals. And it's really important that we understand that, because we often get upset with ourselves for the irrationality of this response without appreciating that our body is experiencing a deep lack of safety from some circumstance. And again, unfortunately, this happens, I think, a lot in medicine, where we feel that we are on the hook, that we are responsible for the very real and sometimes life-threatening situations that our patients are in, often without enough support or backup to be able to adequately assess and address the situation that's going on. And that might be an experience that we have over and over again, right? If that happens to us once, let's say we're in a situation where someone on our team is ill and we have to take, 72 hours of call. And that's an exhausting, overwhelming experience. Let's say there are a lot of patients who come into the emergency room and ultimately need surgery, right? And you're the one who has to do it. That is a very difficult circumstance. If that happens to you one time and you get through it and you have adequate help, that probably will not wire itself into your body as a trauma response. You will remember that as a very difficult circumstance and hopefully get the rest and support that you need. If situations like that seem to happen over and over again, where you're frequently on call, where you don't have enough team members, where you are chronically exhausted and overwhelmed and steeped in anxiety and hypervigilance, that ends up wiring into your body as trauma, and it will feel irrational. But it really does make sense if we zoom out and take a look at it. So if you find yourself judging your own emotional response as being irrational, I want to invite you to see that when we think about the primitive brain and your nervous system, it makes total sense. You are just a normal human. You are having, unfortunately, a normal human response to very difficult circumstances. It doesn't land the same in every single person's body, but it is not your fault. All right, next. There is no difference in your body, in your primitive brain, in your nervous system, between big T and little t trauma. So the same kind of response that happens in a person's body when they are living in, let's say, war-torn circumstances or dealing with, fallout from a hurricane or some other situation, there is no difference in the way that lands in your nervous system compared to little t trauma of having these experiences over and over again where you feel fully responsible and without adequate resources. Again, our rational brain will look at these two circumstances very differently, and it will often look at the little t trauma and say, this doesn't make any sense. I didn't experience X, Y, or Z thing. It will start comparing and judging itself for having that response. Your primitive brain doesn't know any better. Your primitive brain feels a deep sense of lack of safety, and that is how it's showing up when you feel panicky, when your pager goes off, right? When you are crying all the time, when you're having a hard time sleeping, right? If these symptoms are constantly stacking up on you, what is going on, right? You are probably experiencing trauma responses, and it, again, doesn't matter if it's been little t trauma or big T trauma, it's going to manifest often in the same ways. It's important to understand that, again, because we get into this place of judging ourselves for having this response when things are not that bad, air quotes. It lands in our body in the same way, and it deserves the same forms of treatment and attention and care and compassion. And so let's let go of the notion, right, that it's quote unquote just little t trauma, that it's not that big a deal. We're going to let that go and get the help and support that we need. The third thing that I want to share with you is that you can heal. You can heal from having these trauma responses, especially if they're really actively manifesting for you right now. Again, you're crying, you feel like you're having panic responses all the time, you feel like you're constantly responsible and scanning for threats. If you are in that space, you can heal, and we need to think about what that might look like. For some people, we are going to need some time and space away from those experiences, right? So some people are going to need to take a break from working and really have some distance from that level of responsibility. And this is especially true if you are chronically sleep deprived and having these intense panic responses. You may need to pull yourself out of that environment in order to get the support and the time and the rest that you need. Now, that's usually not going to be sufficient, but it may be necessary because you may not be able to calm down and and really sort of allow the deep rest that you might need in order to have some separation and healing that your nervous system is needing. So rest and space are sometimes very necessary, but they are usually not sufficient in order to feel better, right? Because you will still have these deep-seated responses often, again, to this sense of lack of safety. When you experience that, when you recognize, yep, time and space, maybe I've gotten that, maybe I've taken some leave, maybe I've left a job. If you are still having those responses, as most people will, right, because time and space are usually not enough, then it's time to really engage with active work to really help the healing, right? And we have a growing body of resources that are available to us to really help to rewire the nervous system in order to heal these responses. I want to point out one resource and invite you to go back and listen to a past episode where I spoke with Dr. Christy Gibson. I'll put links to that in the show notes, but her wonderful book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, is a wonderful resource that includes easily accessible, I'll say littler and bigger methods for trying to help ground yourself and find some healing. So some of these practices are going to be small things that you can do in the moment, such as activities called havening, where you're touching your face and feeling a sense of comfort and grounding, or rubbing your arms. If you're hearing weird sounds, it's because I'm doing that as we speak and maybe picked up on the mic. But there are some of these body brief exercises that you can do that will help to calm your nervous system in the moment when you need sort of a rapid help. There are other therapies that are available and often very helpful to us. And those can include treatments like EMDR, which is eye movement. I can never remember all the things. I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes. A similar treatment is called Brain-Spotting, and these are both eye movement, brain, primitive response sort of treatments that are usually performed by a therapist or some other trained professional, and they are working on this mind-body connection that is wired into vision and sight. And I'm not trained in those therapies. I have experienced some of those, and I have found them incredibly helpful. But I don't think I can explain it at a deeper level. So I'm just gonna leave it at that those are very effective treatments for many people. There are other very helpful modalities, including internal family systems, which we've also talked about on the show before. This is a therapy model that looks at different parts of ourself, that sees our higher self as kind of the true us, but these other parts of us that sometimes take over, right? If you think about this hypervigilant part of you that sometimes takes over, it is scanning for threats. It is trying to prevent you from harm. But if we stay with hypervigilance as the primary actor, right, we will not get rest and sense of safety. We will constantly be scanning for threats and constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we need to recognize that that part of ourselves thinks that it's helpful, but it is not really what we want to be driving the whole show, right? So parts work or internal family systems looks at those and can be very helpful as well for helping to treat people with trauma responses. I've also done some of that work on myself. I didn't do it on myself. I had a therapist who did that for me. And that was incredibly helpful. There are therapists and coaches and, again, other health professionals who are trained in that. Internal family systems is what you want to look for. There's also a program and really an ancient practice called Yoga Nidra. We've also talked about that on the show before. Yoga Nidra is ancient meditation practice. It's not a movement yoga, it's really a guided meditation that can stimulate very deep rest in the body. And that can also be very helpful for our nervous system when we've experienced trauma responses. There is a program specifically that was put together for the US military as basically a trauma treatment that soldiers and people exposed to combat could engage with, but they didn't want to call it Yoga Nidra because that seemed too touchy-feely. So they came up with this program and they called it iRest, like iPhone, but iRest. And I'll put links to that in the show notes as well. But there are free and paid programs available that people can engage with. Again, trying to really give people additional tools to help treat trauma responses. And this can be very useful to share with patients of yours who might experience difficulties with sleep, difficulties with chronic pain. It can be hard for people to engage with these therapies, of course, when they feel like they're at an extreme. But this really does that longer lasting sort of deep-seated rest and healing that can be very cathartic for people. So as you can see, there are a number of different treatments that can be available, and some of them do rely on another human helping you, but some of them do not. And if you are feeling like you're in a place where you don't feel unsafe in terms of you're not contemplating suicide or self-harm in some way, but you do feel like you need help, you might choose to engage with any of these therapies. Again, whether they depend on another person or not, there are options for both. And just, again, appreciate that you are a person who deserves help. You are a person who deserves healing. It is not your fault if you experience trauma responses. That is not something that you wanted for yourself. That is not something that you engaged with on purpose. That is not a lack of strength. It is not a weakness. It is a way that our primitive brain, that our nervous system sometimes becomes wired in response to situations, again, where there's too much, too fast, and often with too little support. Again, whether that's big T trauma experiences or little T trauma, or maybe, unfortunately, a combination of both things. These are the ways that those experiences show up in our body, and we deserve to get healing for that, even if we seem just fine to other people. I hope that this is helpful. Again, this is something that I have experienced. I have experienced trauma responses in myself. I didn't understand them. I felt like there was something really wrong with me. I judged myself because I had not experienced any big T trauma. And in getting help, I feel so much better. And again, it doesn't mean that sometimes things don't sort of remind me. Of course, we overuse the word trigger, I think, but they remind me of how I felt in those circumstances. And that's just an opportunity for me to remember that I am safe, right? To ground myself, to re-engage with some of those practices and recenter myself, because I do want to continue doing the work that I do, both with patients and with coaching clients. And in order to do that, in order to continue the work that I do that involves a lot of emotions and a lot of talking, I need to take care of myself, and you do too, my friend. I don't care what branch of medicine you're in. You need to take care of yourself, because the work that we do is very real. It's very person and emotion centric. Even if you are a surgeon and you're like, no, my job is fixing broken bones and removing appendixes, you are still seeing people in emotional distress, and you are still needing to engage with them human to human and get their trust, right? Because if you are operating on somebody who does not trust you, my friends, that does not tend to go very well. All right, I'm going to stop going down that rabbit hole. we deserve to take excellent care of ourselves, and understanding these responses that get wired into our bodies is, I think, a critical part of that. And it's something that most of us did not receive an education in, but that's what I'm doing here, is telling you that if this is you, if you have experienced trauma responses, you deserve help and healing, just like any other human being. I wouldn't say that people in the US are doing an amazing job with healing their trauma, right? We've had a lot of incredibly difficult circumstances, as have other people in the world. But I do think that there are other places in the world that seem to be doing a better job of recognizing, the very real struggles that we all face, and doing a better job with mental health support than we're doing. We can catch up. And it starts with us, my friends. All right, that was kind of a heavy one. Thank you for staying with me. I think, again, it's really important that we talk about this, that we help ourselves, that we help our colleagues who don't seem to be like themselves, and we maybe can't explain why. If your colleague seems to be upset a lot, seems to be crying a lot, seems to be acting out, having maybe what you would call tantrums, check in with them, because this may be going on in them. And the very real reality of the work that we do, you may save their life by being a person who checks in with them and helps them to get help that they need. All right. Again, this is a heavy one. Thank you for listening. Reach out if you have questions. There will be resources in the show notes. And until next time, take care. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you as always for listening. To learn more about my coaching programs, head to www.healthierforgood.com. And if you love this podcast, please drop us a review on iTunes or support the show by clicking the link in the show notes. Until next time, take care.